Hello everyone, welcome to the Grow Your Future podcast. I am your host, Zah Azmi, and today I am super excited to introduce you to a very special friend of mine who started out as a client, my youngest client at 19 years old, buying his first investment property, who now works for Luxland as a property consultant. Introducing Daniel Beardall.
Hey guys, how are ya?
How are you, brother?
Really good. Good to have you. Good to be here, mate.
Good to have you on.
Thank you. It's been a long time in the waiting.
We want to know your story, man. Like, 19
awesome.
years old,
Yeah.
first investment property at 19 years old. I actually read in an article a couple of days ago, actually, in the newspaper about a 19-year-old who bought her first property, I think up in Queensland somewhere. I think it was a house and land package or something like that. And they made a massive deal out of it because she's 19 years old and she did it without the help of her parents. It's a big thing. Like, to be buying a property, especially the one you're not even living in, at 19 years old, it's a massive achievement, man. And I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about that first investment.
Yeah, definitely. So for me, I've always loved property or business. I've always been that entrepreneurial type who's always wanted to get ahead in life. And it really happened when I read Rich Dad Poor Dad at about 15, when I had the idea of I wanted to start getting involved in property. And I've always, ever since I left school, been doing my own thing, whether it's starting my own business or fiddling around working for this guy or that guy and following successful people. And then once I was about 18, when I started working in finance, and I would do a lot of loans where people will go in and buying property. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to just start studying it a lot more. So I would go to this seminar, I'd pick up that book, and then I stumbled across yourself. And I was like, Zah, how do I get involved? And then, we had a chat and whatnot, and then we just, from there, and then I looked at what you need to actually do to get involved. And because I was working in finance at the time, I understood the capital structure and how you actually buy a property and what's involved. And from that, I was able to get my hands on a property.
Great. So you had some great influences on you very early on, which is very important, surrounding yourself with the right people. Yeah. Now, the property itself that we got for you, tell us a little bit about the property itself. Yeah,
definitely. So for us, with property, there's so many different strategies around. And at that time, at 19, I was very ambitious and we were discussing my plans for the future. So because we're looking to go very big and have a big vision, we're looking to do a development on the property later down the track. So for us, the property we acquired was something which is zoned R3, which has the potential to put townhouses on it. So for the property we bought, for myself, the property is in Newcastle, a great spot for, say, 3 townhouses. But we might even, down the future, look to purchase next door and do something bigger.
So we bought something it was sub 500K, so it's at an affordable price bracket. It's got some good rent there, it supports itself. I think it gets to like, $450 a week, something like that. But you said something interesting, it's zoned R3. So for our listeners, R3 zoning is medium density, meaning that we can build townhouses. This particular property sits on 750 squares, meaning that we could probably get 3 townhouses on it. So, massive future potential for this particular property. And right now we're taking advantage of, the $440 a week in rent to help pay the mortgage. It holds itself well.
Exactly.
In the future, hopefully that land value grows and then, we go and develop, or we get a DA, a development application approval on the property and, then on sell it, at a higher value. So we're sort of land banking this investment for the future. So it's a long-term play, right, Daniel? But
definitely.
Long-term's great when you're 19 years old because, you've got so much time. Like, imagine what that property is going to be worth, when you're 50, 60 years old if you still hold it. I'd love to develop it, do the townhouses, and then retain the holdings of the townhouses and get that passive income through.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because when I was first looking to buy a property, there's so many different strategies available. You buy and hold, do you buy something for capital growth? Do you buy something that's got good cash flow? Our strategy was something where we could do forced appreciation, so develop on it. And then you've also got the strategy of tax benefits. People buy new build properties where they can reap the benefits of the depreciation. But
So a lot of strategies there,
there's so
Daniel.
many there's so many different strategies, and also the location where you're going to buy.
And they're all great strategies. You know,
right.
if you execute it well, those strategies all have a place in our portfolio. But your particular strategy is...
Yeah, we're a bit more aggressive, especially that being so young. I wanted to take that risk where we could be really, instead of letting the market dictate our return, I wanted to dictate the return. So that's where something like forced appreciation really comes in our favor, because I can really go in and force 100 grand off that property by just getting a DA approval. So
I love that about property.
Yeah.
I love it about property where, as an asset, you can control it. You sort of can get into business, because property is a business, right?
100%.
You're buying a stream of income. But you can get into that business, but have so much certainty on the back end. I mean, we're not talking about... We haven't really talked about the market right now. You're talking about forced appreciation. So for our listeners that don't know that means, you know, we might renovate the property, we might develop on it, and that means we manufacture that equity so we can take that growth and put it into our... You know, we can just take the cash and enjoy it if we really wanted to, but we essentially want to put that into our next property. So that's what I love about property as a business, because you can get into it, know what your margins are, you know. If the market rises, great, right? It's a bonus. But in our feasibility analysis, we sort of look at it as, okay, how much money are we going to make on it? Is it 100% cash on cash return? Is it a 20%, you know, on costs, right? Exactly. Are we going to get the 5 to 6% yield? Because we know what that demographic is demanding. What are the vacancy rates? Like, we have access to all of this data. You know, we can see things like median house values. Where are we buying? Are we buying above the median, or are we buying below the median? There are so many things that you can sort of really hone in on and get a firm control of what your return is going to be. That's what I love about property.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the deeper you get into property, and what I learnt from you, which was probably the biggest thing I got when we did the transaction, was there's so many ways you can profit in the deal. So where we actually made a lot of profit was negotiations, where we were actually, instead of me paying, say, another 20 grand on top of what the price was going to be, we were able to save that, but using the strategy that I didn't know of until I engaged you. So we'll just tell you guys the strategy, because I think it's something which you can take away and use it yourself.
You're going to give all my secrets
away,
we're
going to do some little secrets also. But so what we did was, we'll say the purchase price was 480,000, I think it was. And then we went to, you engage a conveyancer or solicitor to do the contract and pay your deposit for you. So we were looking at the property and we said, yep, we want to do it. And the property was established, so it's second-hand stock, it's not brand new, so there's going to be some work that potentially needs to be done to get it up to scratch. And I didn't know you could do this at the time, but we got a pest and building report. And the pest and building report came back saying, look, there's about $30,000 worth of renovations or damages that may need to be done on the property before it's, you know, at a livable state.
Okay, so let's just stop right there. A pest and building report is always going to point out the negatives, which is good for us, right? It's good for us as investors, as buyers, because a pest and building report will never point out the positives. It's not a pest and builder's inspector job to point out the good things about the property. It's his job to point out the bad things, because that can work in our favor. What did we then do with that information, Daniel?
So the key, what we did, instead of us taking that information and going to the seller and saying, there's $30,000 worth of damage, can you reduce the price? What the key was, we actually took that to our solicitor and conveyancer, and they went and did the negotiation. And so it's a bit more powerful when you've got someone that's a solicitor or conveyancer going to the vendor and saying, look guys, there's all this, we've agreed on a price here, but there's all these damages that need to be amended. Can you do a reduction in the price?
So the perception of the negotiation then comes from a professional rather than you as the investor. It removes the emotion and it's all about logic, right? Now, just a disclaimer. A lot of conveyancers don't like doing it. You need to have people on your team who are willing to fight in your corner. And also, a lot of real estate agents think that's a little bit sneaky. They know what you're up to. But hey, we're trying to get the best deal possible. We are investors. We're not getting emotional about the deal. We're trying to save money, because essentially that's making money.
Definitely. And I think that's what you just said then. I think the key as well with properties, you've actually got to get a team on board, and you've got to get professionals. I think what I've learned is that you do need to be a jack of all trades before you even consider buying a property. But it's like being a builder, a project manager on a building site. You may not be a plumber or a carpenter, but at least you know each of every trade. Because when you buy a property, you've got to engage with a mortgage broker or a banker, an accountant, a solicitor, a buyer's agent or a real estate agent. You've got to get your maybe piss and building report, a valuer, all these different professionals which help you and to do the actual transaction.
It's the key trait of an entrepreneur, being a generalist,
Yeah.
right? We talked about this in a previous podcast about knowing a little bit of information about everything. You don't need to be an expert in that field, because what you do is you delegate those tasks out. But if you've got those people on your team and they are in line with your vision and they know what you're trying to achieve, then at least you have a better understanding of how to convey that vision to them. So Dan, that was a super successful story. How much did we end up paying for the property?
I think we ended up paying $440 on the actual property. Plus you got your stamp duty and legal fees and other professional fees involved. So let's say in total it was another 20 grand. And then we did another, say 10 or 20 grand worth of renovations.
Just to bring it up to scratch, right? So we can get that rental income.
We removed the asbestos shed, got a new shed in there, fixed some pillars, carpet and paint. Just the basic, didn't want to spend as much, just the basics to get the property livable. In the back of our minds thinking that we may even knock this property down to develop on it. So we were really trying to be smart with the capital we spent on the property's renovations, just so it could be rented out.
So meaning we didn't want to overcapitalise, spend too much money, and then eventually have to knock the place down in 3 or 4 years, and then all of that money is wasted. All we were trying to do is bring it up to scratch, carpet, paint, bits and pieces around the place, just to get it rented. So then it washes its own face as we hold the property for the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so today's podcast, we really want to jump into the basics of property investing. And this is for our younger listeners, because I think they can really resonate with your story. You're still young, you're 22 years old, you're now working as a property investment advisor underneath myself. You know a fair bit at such a young age. Let's delve into all of the things that you have learned, so that these other people who are listening to us, who want to get into the market, they might be 17, 18, 19, or 22 years old, have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
Education is key,
100%.
right? Like knowing what you're doing before you sign a contract of sale, surrounding yourself with the right people, and also, figuring out what is your goal.
Definitely.
Right? So we need to cover so many aspects before you sort of jump in. So let's get started.
All right. So I think if we start at the top level, it's getting educated. And I think for myself, it took a good 7 years worth of day in, day out, 5 hours a day.
How old are you?
So I really started getting serious about property and business at 15. So once you start doing work experience at school, I was working for a family friend who's got a successful finance company where they do private lending and non-conforming loans. And from there, I really got an interest into I wanted to get my hands dirty with how money works. So from 15 to 18, while I'm still in high school, after school, instead of doing my HSC works or whatever, I'm going out reading all these books, studying property, watching your Grant Cardone, all your people on YouTube and podcasts to try and immerse myself with
Zah Azmi.
Zah, all those figures, right? And I think that's the key. You've got to start off by getting the right pockets of information. At the start, you may not know who's the best people for that, but eventually you start weeding out who is.
And there's a lot out there, right? There's so much information. Let's take it back to when I was 15, very long time ago, 20 years ago. You didn't have social media. You didn't have, the internet was only really just in its infancy stage. We didn't have access to all of this information. Like, we were old school. We were in books, right?
Yeah.
And, it's funny how you say you read Rich Dad Poor Dad at 15. I actually read it at 16.
Oh, wow.
We had magazines back then. My mum used to bring home magazines. She used to get them from work, Australian Property Investor, all of those types of magazines. That was my first taste. And I envy the young people now. Like, I really do. They have access to so much. I think maybe too much.
Yeah.
And it's interesting what you said, Dan. You go, you've got to really pick and choose who you listen to, because if you listen to too many people, what happens?
Yeah, you just get overloaded and you
Get confused.
Yeah, exactly right. And what I've learned now, the best piece of advice I could give you now is that sometimes the best information is no information, because you've really got to be a filter with what you take in. Because if you listen to me, for example, and I tell you only from my experience, it may not be the right information that you need to hear. And if you hear that and listen to it, it could be detrimental to.
It's a really good point, Dan, because a lot of people come to me and go, Zah, I need to read a book. Can you recommend something? And it's like, well, that's a very hard recommendation to make, because I don't know what you actually require in life right now, right? Like, are you trying to, save money? Are you trying to do an apartment building development? Are you trying to get a job? Like, what is it, right? So many people just blurt it out there and go, just give me something. And it's like, well, you've got to get specific. You've got to really know what's going on in your life right now. What do you need to improve on?
Exactly.
Because there's no use reading a children's book from kindergarten, because that's not going to teach you anything, because we're trying to move ahead, right? I had this conversation with one of my team members during the week, and I said, look, stop reading things that you gravitate towards because it's easy. You're like, this particular team member knew everything in this book, or this type of book, and what she needed to do was read something where she didn't know. Because that's what you've got to keep doing. You've got to keep growing. You've got to think of these books as these tools, or these people. They're actually people, right? And you're reading into their lives. Now, if these people are on a lower level to you, then what's going to happen is you're not going to really learn anything new, right? You need to learn off people who you really aspire to be like.
Exactly.
People who know more than you. People who are better than you. That's why they always say, be a forever student, right? Always upgrade and try and tap into the minds of the greats.
Definitely. And I think as well, from what I've learned, is that you're not going to learn this from one book or two books. To get a really big understanding of property and finance, I've had to go to university. I've got a degree in commerce and finance. Whilst I was doing my degree, I've been working as a lender BDM, learning finance, how loans have been written. I've been flying interstate, meeting brokers, trying to get business. So there's so many parts involved. At the time, I was also starting my own business. So what I would recommend is don't just be someone that does one thing for one outcome. When I go to the gym, for example, I go to the gym, but I might listen to my audiobooks. So whenever you do anything in life, try and kill 2 or 3 birds with one stone. That would be my advice when you're trying to learn this stuff as well. As much as it's important to listen to the right people, you've also got to immerse yourself with the content, and don't be someone who's like, oh, I'm going to go to uni or not go to uni. We'll do both. Go to uni and work.
Be open-minded. Be open-minded
right?
with everything. Be open-minded. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, they shun education because they think of it as boring or a waste of money.
Exactly.
Right? And I'm at a point where I still pay for education, right? Like I treat myself as a forever student.
Yeah.
And I'm at a point now, because my personal brand's so strong in property, I'll go sign up for educational courses, and those people will knock me back because they're too scared that I'm going to take their IP. But in actual fact, I genuinely want to learn from everyone around me. People who are in the property industry within Australia, I really look up to. I think they're great, and I will still spend tens of thousands of dollars on my self-education to make sure that I'm always up to date and I'm always learning. And you're going to have a hit and miss rate. Like, some of those courses aren't going to be that good.
Yeah, and there's so many.
Yeah, they're going to be basic, and you're going to know like a lot of the information that's in it, especially if you're always learning. But the key is just to never stop, right?
Exactly.
To keep going.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think, like, even example, I've recently just done a course that costs $5,000 to expand my knowledge on, say, option, how you go about securing real estate using option contracts and different styles of forced appreciation, which I know of on a basic level, but when you get to the specifics, you've got to pay that extra dollar to learn it. You can't just, I could go and try and wing it myself, but to really get a result and improve on it, you've got to pay to learn it.
And I've done that options course. I know the one that you're talking about, right? And I don't actually do a lot of options with what I do. It's very different. But I've taken a lot away from that course, implemented into my portfolio and into my business. And there was so many golden nuggets that I could take from that and then put it into what I'm trying to do, which is custom, right? Everyone's got this custom strategy that works for them. So even if you take one thing away from that $5,000 course, that's $5,000 worth spent.
Exactly. And I think it's also important as well when we're looking to get into this, we've really got to map out why we want to get into it as well. So for me, it was I wanted to really be a successful individual, not only in business, but also outside of business. And to do that, you've got to be consistently growing in financially to learn more and also to support others around you. But I think as well on the strategy, it's really important when we're going to buy a property that we have our strategy mapped out. Because it's like we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, the statistics are people aren't going to be buying more than, say, 3 or 4 properties in reality.
Well, now moving into this, I guess, we could call it post-COVID. I like to call it post-COVID because we just want to leave it behind us, right? But let's say we're in this post-COVID stage of finance or era, right? It's a new decade. And what's going to happen now is money's so cheap. Like you can get loans at 2% interest rate. So for $1 million, it costs you $20,000 to hold $1 million worth of debt. Like it's crazy, right? So what's going to happen post-COVID, everyone's going to jump into this. You know, they're going to pull the handbrakes up. They have to because everybody's going to want credit. And it's going to be hard, right? Serviceability is going to go through the roof. Like they're calculators. They're going to really judge you on really high interest rates. And it's going to be harder to get credit. And hence the reason why we're encouraging a lot of people to take out home loans now if they can. So moving into, say, the 10 properties in 10 years probably will be unattainable for a lot of people. We'll still shoot for that. But realistically, once you get to the 3, 4, 5 properties, you're probably going to be maxed out. I'm talking about the average income earner. And it's going to be hard to keep borrowing. So the key is, Dan, is that if you've got, say, 3, 4, 5 properties to buy, don't you think that they have to be crackers?
Exactly.
They've got to be
100%.
really, really good properties. Because if they're not, you've sort of wasted your opportunity in buying something.
And especially in an Australian market, the cost of acquiring a property is so expensive outside of just buying the asset. You've got stamp duty, you've got all these professional fees. If you buy a bad asset and you have to sell it, you're going to have to pay capital gains tax. All these fees involved are real estate agent fees. So when we are buying the asset, we have to make sure it's a 10 out of 10. Otherwise, it's going to cost us so much money just in mistakes, which we could have done by learning through other people or books. And I think it's really important, like you said, to make sure that purchase is a 10 out of 10.
And that's why education is so important, right? Because some people say, oh, education's expensive. It costs so much to get educated. Well, try not being educated. Because if you're not educated, you buy the wrong asset and you essentially lose millions of dollars in opportunity cost, right? And you're stuck with lemons, right? Like I have lemons in my portfolio, but it's okay. I can afford to have lemons because I've got so many properties. Reality is, people aren't going to be able to build 10, 20, 30 property portfolios anymore. It's just not going to be easy for them unless their incomes are like millions of dollars. So credit's going to get a lot harder. It's not going to get any easier. So all the more reason we need to pick the right assets.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for all the younger listeners as well who want to get into property, I think it's important to map out your next 3 steps. So I think from the general person, it's about looking at yourself and saying, where am I today financially? Because with property, it's not about saying how much do I have and how much do I have to put of my own money to buy the property. With property, property is made up of a capital structure of debt and equity. And the key to actual property success is to maximize your debt. Because if property does double, say every 10 years, for example, and you've bought an asset worth $1 million and you've borrowed, say, 900 grand, and it doubles, you've got 900 grand worth of debt, but now you've got an asset worth 2 million. So the key is actually to when we talk property, we actually want to be maximizing the amount of debt we've got. So my goal for myself is to go out and buy, say, 100 properties, all with maxed out debt, because that debt's going to be insignificant when that portfolio doubles in 10 years' time. So then the question becomes, how do we go about attaining a portfolio which we can hold for 10 years? And it's important that we look at properties that can grow in value, but also are cash flow positive. Or they don't hurt your cash flow to purchase the next property. Because the key with looking about acquiring debt is you've got to be able to service that debt. Debt is what we take off from a lender. So a debt is separate to equity, where equity, the benefit of an equity partner is they get a profit share, where with debt, the benefit of debt is you get interest payments if you were issuing debt.
So let's just stop there, Dan, because I actually can't believe this guy's 22, right? And he just knows all of this. Yeah. Let's like translate this down to our younger listeners who need to understand the whole model of debt, right? Yeah. You just mentioned that you've got $900K worth of debt, you've got a $1 million property, in 10 years' time it's worth, say, $2 million, right? And that debt still stays at 900. We spoke about this in a previous podcast about inflation, right? What do you know about inflation? And, can you tell our listeners about inflation and how that affects the debt?
Yeah, definitely. So inflation is generally, how we look at inflation, it's the general price increase of products over a given period of time. And typically our target inflation is 2 to 3%, which means that if we are investing money, we want to be making sure that our investment is at least giving us a 2 to 3% return to have the same purchasing power, for that cash to have the same purchasing power as it does today in the future.
And this is what they call a hedge against inflation.
Exactly. So, so back onto the point of inflation with debt. Inflation is I guess a key indicator for us to see how prices are changing, but debt is a byproduct typically of our cash rate set by the RBA. So the RBA will go and introduce a cash rate. Then from the cash rate set, the big four banks like CBA, NAB, Westpac will look at that cash rate and assess their book, and they will adjust their interest rates accordingly. So when recently we've reduced our cash rate to say 0.25%, lenders now have reduced the interest rate. So the cost of borrowing is so cheap. But what will happen when we have higher inflationary periods is the RBA might increase the cash rate so people are less reliant on debt to go and spend money. Because when we're having high inflation, the government wants to reduce how much we're spending. So a way they do that is they reduce how much capital we have, and they reduce the amount of capital we have by making it cost us more money to borrow that capital.
So basically, the governments have levers, right, to control spending, control the economy, which makes us feel a lot better about the situation we're in at the moment, because realistically, the government can sort of help us get to where we need to go. Exactly. The whole world might seem like it's caving in because of COVID and all of that sort of thing, but the government does a good job in terms of controlling that economy, reeling it back in when they need to, print more money if they have to. So a lot of the doomsday talkers about things are going to collapse and the whole world's going to cave in. It's not really going to happen, is it?
I agree, and I think especially in Sydney and Melbourne and even Brisbane, our markets are so strong, and the city itself they're so diverse with the property involved. Like if we were to go to Melbourne, Melbourne's not just a Melbourne market. We've got all these unique suburbs within Melbourne. Same with Sydney and Brisbane. So I think when we're looking at the cost of borrowing today being so cheap, I think it's important for us to go and look at our situation to say, how can we go and leverage all this free money basically to go and deploy it into all these different markets to capitalize on that. So
to really sort of reel it in and really sort of simplify everything, because the average investor, usually our podcast listeners, they want to build a portfolio of 3, 4, 5 properties maybe. What they've got to do is, I guess, go out and get the debt. What we're telling them is go out and acquire as much debt as you can, but make sure it's backed by cash flow. Exactly. Because we're still got to pay back that debt.
Yeah. So the way to look at it is you want to be the person that has the potential to have access to the most amount of debt as possible. And the way you have access to that debt is you have to have a strong cash flow position to service that debt. So if you're say 18 or 19, instead of your focus being trying to save as much equity as possible to go and buy a property, your focus needs to be about how can I as an individual go to the marketplace to earn money so I can service the maximum amount of debt to leverage to go and buy as many properties as possible.
And it's sort of an art, isn't it? Because everybody's different. Everybody has different incomes. Everyone has different liabilities. Everyone has different JV partnerships with either their spouse or business partners. So everybody's situation is different. So it's not a one size fits all. So it's really important to know your stats, know your assets, liabilities, your income,
definitely,
and know how much money you are able to borrow. I think one of the interesting statistics I stumbled across the other day was, anyone with over $3 million worth of debt, as in good debt, is in the top, I think, 1 or 2% of Australia. So, we need to sort of, you don't want to take out too much debt to the point where it's uncontrollable. But as long as you've got that cash flow backing it. So when we say cash flow, that's rental income from property investments, right? So if we're returning, say, a 4 to 5% yield, but we're sort of borrowing cash at 2.5%, then we're in front. Our expenses are paid, and you can keep going and you can keep borrowing. But what about this thing called negative gearing, Dan?
So I never recommend negative gearing for someone starting out the first purchase unless you really want to take advantage of the tax benefits. The reason
our listeners will want to know what negative gearing is. Give us an example.
So negative gearing is when the cash flow from the property, being the rental income, it doesn't service the expense of the property, so the debt.
So, for example, if the rental income yields, say, 2%, when we're borrowing money at, say, 3%, that 1% loss.
Exactly. And the problem with having a property like that in your portfolio is that it hurts your potential to buy the next one. As good as it may be in your portfolio today because we can save our own money on tax, it actually hurts your ability to purchase the next deal. So it's actually a cancer in your portfolio.
I like that, cancer, right? Because it really does hurt you.
It does, significantly.
And now, we've talked about for the last half an hour how hard it's going to be to acquire credit, to get more debt in the future. It's even more important to get those positive cash flow properties that yield between 4 5%. But let's talk about, what about those properties that yield, say, 8, 9, 10, 11%. They might be in mining towns. They might be in rural areas. The yields are massive. Like it's literally 11%. What about those properties, Dan? What do we think about them?
So I'll give you a key example. So when we were doing a lot of the loans when I was working, a lot of people that had that high cash flow strategy were trying to buy things like student accommodation, boarding houses, things close to unis, mining towns where they can put a lot of people in the one spot and maximize return. The problem with some of those asset classes, though, is that the capital growth may not be as attractive because there's not much land content. They're trying to maximize the amount of people in the one space. So we've got to it's a juggling act, right? Like you say to me, there's house and land and there's also apartments. Maybe we can come in the middle and find a townhouse where we get the best of both worlds. So I think it's important to, like we say, know your strategy, and we go about finding what's the next best asset to keep you going along the
key word being you, right? Because everybody's different.
Exactly.
And going back to the high yielding strategy, those mining towns, student accommodation, and sometimes these properties are advertised with 9, 10, 11% yields, and everyone gets attracted to them because of the cash flow, right? But I listened to a very well-known developer by the name of Tim Gurner, who owns Gurner, and he builds big high-rise apartments, an absolute expert in property development. And he goes on to say that if you've got a yield bigger than 6%, for example, because you've really got to question that asset. There's a reason why that yield is so high. It's because it probably doesn't have any growth aspect. It may even go backwards, and it might be very, very volatile. So you might get that 9, 10% initially, but when something hits, as in maybe a recession, you're going to lose that capital. And we want to make sure we're in that, I think, that healthy 4 to 5%. That's what we try and do here at Luxland.
Yeah, exactly right. And like the strategies we try and recommend to clients is that you want to be purchasing assets where they do the heavy lifting for you, where they save the next equity, the equity for your next purchase, instead of you having to go and save that money from your day job.
I like that phrase, the heavy lifting. You know, what do you think contributes to the heavy lifting of an asset appreciating in value?
So I've got a bit of a checklist on macroeconomic factors that contribute to capital growth. And that's essentially what does the heavy lifting for you, is capital growth. And the macroeconomic factors that typically lead to that are kind of different to what you contemporarily think. Because a lot of people push this idea of location. But if location truly was it, then everyone would be investing in the Gold Coast, where it's, you know, the best beaches in Australia, it's the best lifestyle, but actually the capital growth there isn't as strong as maybe Sydney or Melbourne. So some of the economic factors that do contribute, well, the biggest one that contributes to capital growth is scarcity of stock and high demand from high income earners that can pay a premium for your asset. And those people are people that are going to purchase an owner-occupied property, which is separate to us as investors, where we're purchasing an investment property. So if I was to say to you guys, if you're really wanting to maximize your capital growth, look at suburbs or pockets where you've got high income earners purchasing that asset. So that actually eliminates a lot of the stock out west. So I think it's important.
Nothing against people from out west.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And
this is all data that we can look at. So for our listeners, we're not guessing the demographics here. We're not guessing the incomes of people. We've got actual hardcore evidence of how much a pocket or a suburb has in terms of weekly family incomes compared to the state average.
Exactly.
We know what that demographic is built up of. We can actually score that demographic out of 10 in terms of its affluence score. So what we want to do is, yes, supply and demand, where that scarcity value is, where there's a lot of owner-occupier residency in that particular pocket. But at the same time, we want to make sure that particular demographic has high enough incomes to push those prices up, because those emotional buyers are going to throw money at these assets that are going to completely just keep rising, right? And they're the markets we want to be in as investors. And this is what a lot of property investors get wrong. They think, okay, I'll just buy that thing for 300 grand out west. It'll tick itself over and eventually it'll make money. But the thing is, you've got no one out in those suburbs fighting.
Exactly.
You know, they're not at auctions going, look, I'll pay 100 grand more. I'll pay 200 grand more. My wife loves it. They're thinking with their hearts, right? Not buying with their heads. So we want that type of stock where, you know, it's going to make those big jumps because you've got people fighting for it.
Exactly. And I think a prime example is even the Newcastle property I've got. I probably wouldn't recommend that as a 10 out of 10 capital growth place. But for us, it's a different strategy where we're going to do forced appreciation. So it's, like we were saying, it's very important to learn what areas do have the best capital growth pockets. So,
of course. So I think with buying in regional towns like we've done for you, Daniel, is a perfect starting point. Like I started with regional and worked my way up to the big cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. But regional areas are a really good starting point because of its affordability. The yields are generally quite strong, and it's a conservative approach where it's quite safe. Right? You're always going to get that rental return as long as you buy right. You're going to get some land content, which is really hard to do in the cities. Like if you've only got, say, $500,000 to spend, forget about getting, any land content in Sydney. Melbourne, you won't get anything. Brisbane, you're going to have to go maybe 20, 30 Ks out. But, regional towns, for example, if you had 500 grand to spend, you can buy in the blue chip pockets of that regional town and be in an affluent sort of area to make sure that you've sort of armored yourself with the best decision in terms of an investment. And it's a good starting point. Like I invested in 6 or 7 properties first in regional areas before I went into the major cities. So I think it's a great starting point.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely so. And I think as well, it can actually be unrealistic to be buying in Sydney, where the blue chip stock is in Sydney, because the cost of holding it is going to be so expensive, because the rental yield of that asset is going to be very low relative to buying in the regional places, because you're going to have, because the purchase price is so much smaller, your rental yields are going to be better.
Yeah, so the affordable price points are really attractive for us as investors, especially first-time investors, because we're speaking to a lot of a very big young audience, right? So I guess this brings me to my next my next topic of conversation, where it's rent vesting, right? Like, it's a big special word now. Explain to our listeners what rent vesting is.
So where you rent where you live and you invest in another property?
Yeah, so that suits a lot of people that live in Sydney, right?
Yeah.
Because living in Sydney, as we know, the median house price is around $1 million. Now, buying your first property for $1 million, and you're not really going to get anything special for that, is going to be quite difficult. So a good strategy to deploy is this rent vesting strategy, where you invest in these regional towns, spend maybe $500-600 grand on a property that gives off a good yield of, say, 4 or 5%. Let that sort of accumulate in value in the background, and then rent where you want to live in Sydney, because if the yields are low in Sydney, that means the rents are low. So you can rent something for, say, $600 a week that's worth maybe, $1.2 million.
Exactly right. And one of the best things I can advise you on from a lending point of view is when you actually buy an owner-occupied property, it hinders your serviceability for the next purchase. So actually rent investing is a lot better for you in being able to access more capital because of your access to service to lending. So it's an important strategy when you are starting out to actually not go and buy the place you live in. You're better off going renting and purchasing a couple of properties first.
And that's because your house doesn't produce an income,
exactly.
Right? So it's not necessarily a bad strategy to buy a house, but it does roadblock you in terms of borrowing more money to do further investment.
Yeah. So if I was to say, do I buy a home that I live in first or rent and buy? 100% rent and buy in terms of a financial point of view. Obviously, where you live is an emotional purchase, and we treat it differently. But if you're young and you can afford to rent versus to buy, I would definitely do that rent investing for as long as you can, if not indefinitely.
And it's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a lot of people work towards buying their own home that they can live in, and they are unsure if that's going to be the right decision or not. And I think that's going to be the way of the world moving forward, because if you really want to build wealth, you need to try and accumulate as many assets as possible. Like, really build that asset base up so that you can hold them to help you retire in the future.
Exactly right. And that's, I guess, the main point of why we invest in property, is so we've got something there for when we do retire.
And the earlier you start, Dan, the better it is, 100%. Right? Why?
Compounding, guys. So if you, like we said, if property does double every 10 years, if I buy something for 500 grand when I'm 20, by the time I'm 30, it's worth $1 million. From 30 to 40, it's worth $2 million, and then it keeps doubling. So the earlier you get in, the more money you can create without even doing anything.
So you starting at 19 years old is beautiful, because there's so many more decades to look forward to in terms of that compound growth. But the key is for you is to keep buying as many as you can, and then hold on for dear life.
Exactly right. And take advantage of the markets doing all the heavy lifting. But for us, because we're a bit more active in property and we do it for a job as well, we go and do some different strategies where we're actively seeking to make a return using our skill set. So for the average person listening, they might do a strategy where they just buy and hold, where they're not going about doing your DA approvals, developments and things like that. I recommend for those guys just doing a set and forget strategy, where you buy the asset and ignore it, and it does all the heavy lifting for you.
And for most people, that strategy works,
exactly
right? So, and then you can afford to be creative later on down the track. Dan, we're almost at the end of the podcast. Any last tips for our young listeners to get into the market?
Yeah.
Give them some advice in terms of, how can they get their serviceability up? What type of properties should they be looking at? Yep. Just give them a starting platform to get launched.
So in terms of getting yourself set to actually service to buy a loan, you've got two ways. You either a pay-as-you-go person, where you work for a company and you're an employee. So you have a different set of access to capital as a borrower versus if you own your own business. Two completely different applicants, right? So to actually speed up your process as fast as possible, you're better off being an employee to start, because you've got consistent income, which your lender will actually verify and is happy to give you money.
So that's the golden ticket, having a pay slip.
Having a pay slip is the golden ticket in lending. However, if you're someone who wants to own their own business, it's a slower process because you maybe inconsistent income. You're going to have to get 2 years worth of trading. So it's a lot. Your access to capital initially is harder, but in the future you get access to a lot more variety of funding. So it's a kind of balancing act. So you got to really work out: do I want to be an employee or do I want to be a self-employed person?
And everybody's different, and there's no right or wrong answer.
So I would say it's really important that you have to make a decision quite early on because it affects how you can actually buy property. So first step would to be pick which one you're going to be and just do it for 2 years because that's how you're going to be able to borrow money. So either be an employee or work for yourself, but really give it a crack. So
and try and earn as much money as you can.
Exactly right.
Because the banks love that.
Exactly. So that would be my first piece of advice. Second piece would be to definitely get a mentor, or if you don't know what to do, pay someone who does. Because there's so many different aspects of buying a property that you will never learn off your first purchase. Because when we're actually buying property, we only look at a few deals really before we buy the property. So unless you're in lending or you're a real estate agent or something in the field, you're not actually getting exposed to the frequency of deals. So if you're someone who's not in finance or in that profession of getting access to deal flow, I really recommend you consult with someone, either someone who's done it, books, education. I think it's crucial because you won't actually know the process, and it can be daunting.
And if you don't want to spend any money on education, like at least listen to this podcast. It's free. You can go on YouTube or you can go on iTunes or Spotify. You can download this podcast for free and learn off us. Like we've done it before. Yeah. So Dan, I want to thank you for coming in. It's been a pleasure having you on. We're going to get you on a regular basis now. And I want to thank our listeners and our viewers for listening and watching this podcast today. Until next time, we will see you later.
Thanks, guys.